It gets very confusing because there's so much information out there now. There's so much to know that it becomes blinding.
Hi, I'm Lee Labrada, and I'm here with my friend, Dr. Dan Gartney. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks for having me.
And Dan is not only a medical doctor, but he is one of the foremost authorities on athletic performance. And Dan, as a former bodybuilder like myself, you've competed in contests, and if you remember back in the 80s, I'm dating ourselves here.
Well, yes.
Okay, back in the 80s, we were almost frightened of consuming fats because we thought that fats were the enemy. So what do you think of that whole concept of avoiding fats in a diet?
Well, let's go back briefly in our time capsule. The low-fat diet was originally developed by heart doctors to help combat heart disease, because back then, and it still is a major killer, but it was the number one killer in the U.S. And they developed the low-fat diet thinking that would reduce fats and cholesterol in the blood, which make your arteries narrower. The logic behind it was very good. The American Dietetic Association got behind it, and it was never initially intended to be a weight loss diet. It was meant to be a heart-healthy diet. And in the genius of that thinking, logical thinking, but not scientifically correct thinking, they also introduced trans fats and high carbohydrate fat substitutes.
Bad combination.
Bad combination, and actually it introduced the obesity epidemic to the U.S. That was probably the worst dietary choice they could have done for what is really facing us now. So what we found was that there is an essential amount of fat that you need in your diet, that restricting your fat causes a number of changes that are not beneficial, and the substitutes that you place into your diet for fat were deleterious.
And I remember that back in the day when I was competing and dieting down for the Mr. Olympia, I would reach a point where it seemed like my body fat wouldn't go any lower. It was kind of difficult. And in retrospect, I think it's because I was cutting my fat so low. And so today, what I do is I eat a lot of essential fats, especially omega-3s that I get from fish and things like that. So let's talk a little bit about essential fats and omega-3s and how important they are in the diet.
It gets very confusing because there's so much information out there now. And for people who don't have a background, it's paralysis by choice. We know about saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, omega-3, omega-6, omega-9. There's so much to know that it becomes blinding. Basically, saturated fats are primarily animal fats. And although they're often the bad player, when you look at the science and when you read the mainstream media, they're also essential, and our body will make saturated fats if we're not getting enough. So you want your diet to contain some essential, or to contain some saturated fat.
So some examples of saturated fat.
Palmitic acid, stearic acid. They're
okay, but like foods, because I'm not going to go eat palmitic acid.
Beef. I don't know. Beef, pork fats.
Okay. Pork, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So you hear the other white meat because the meat is lean, but it still has the fat trimmings. You need fat in your diet. Let's talk about why you need fat in general to begin with.
Okay.
Fat is what makes the membranes around the cells, and fat also makes messenger hormone-like signals for our body. So it's essential not only for the structure, the integrity of our body, but also the way it communicates with itself in terms of what's a healthy state and an unhealthy state. When you deprive yourself of the fats, the turnover is happening so much that your body does sense a crisis and begins making more fat. We can make fat without eating any. So taking it out of your diet does nothing except introduce a deficiency our body corrects.
Interesting.
Right.
Now that deficiency is not always just like omega-3s or that kind of thing.
No, it can be saturated fats as well. That's why you have to maintain some of that in your dietary fat. Omega-3 fats are very, very popular. The fish oils. EPA DHA is what they're known by. And they're touted as being very beneficial because some properties seen with them is that they aid in cardiovascular, protecting against cardiovascular risk, and they aid in weight loss. Two very, very big target goals for not just bodybuilders, but for the general public. Omega-6 fatty acids are not necessarily bad. It's when there's an imbalance, because they can create these, when I talked about the messenger signals, omega-6 can create pro-inflammatory signals.
Okay.
And inflammation in the body,
is bad.
The omega-3s will protect against that somewhat or even combat it.
But somebody can't go crazy just eating a bunch of omega-3s.
You can have an omega-6 deficiency because omega-6 is an essential fatty acid too.
So what would you say are some good guidelines for guys and gals out there that are exercising vigorously, working out? How should they go about getting the right amount of omega-3s and omega-6s?
Omega-3s are difficult for most people because you're looking primarily at fish as the source. And for many people, fish is an expensive food choice. And it's also one that does require some preparation skills, unless you're just going to eat canned tuna all the time, which you and I probably have in our day, probably killed an entire herd of tuna. What people recommend then is that you try to get 2 to 3 servings of fish in your diet. Salmon is a very common, that's a great one. Steelhead trout's a great one. Mostly your migratory deep sea fishes. Tilapia is not such a great choice. And if you can have that 2 or 3 times a day, that's a good food base because, again, too, we're talking about a nutritional source.
So you're talking 2 or 3 servings of fish per day?
No, I'm sorry, per week.
Per week.
If I misspoke, if I said that. However, that's not the optimal amount. That's a necessary amount. And to get the remainder, it really helps to supplement. You can supplement through capsules, but you end up requiring quite a few of them. You want 1 to 3 grams of the EPA DHA, not 1 to 3 grams of fish oil.
Right.
But 1 to 3 grams of the EPA and DHA content.
Gotcha.
And what I use personally is there's a fish oil that I pour into a teaspoon, and I take it that way. And I take 1 teaspoon, which is about 2.5 grams.
Okay, and so that's how you take your fish oil. What about the omega-6? How do we make sure that we got enough omega-6 or not too much omega-6?
We generally aren't too concerned about too much omega-6. If you eat mostly plant-sourced oils, you're going to get plenty of omega-6, your safflower, and other sources like that. If you are eating for omega-9, which is another type, that's primarily olive oil is a source.
So maybe a tablespoon or a teaspoon of olive oil each day in the diet would be good for that?
What a lot of people will do is use it as a dressing.
Okay.
They might use it as a dressing over their vegetables. They might use it as a dressing over their salad. For me, I just like to know, and I pour it into a teaspoon. There's nothing impalatable about it. It's not the oil. Do you remember your mom giving you cod liver oil to punish you? It's not like that at all. So I think for most bodybuilders, they just want to know they're having it and want to have it quick. Pouring it into a teaspoon is one way. If you do it in food preparation, another way is to use as a dressing. You can also pour it directly into your shakes, and it won't affect the taste or the consistency of your protein shakes.
So in conclusion, fat is not the enemy.
Fat's not the enemy. Too much fat is the enemy.
Right.
But fat is not the enemy.
And eating the right fats obviously always makes the difference.
That's the goal.
I'm Lee Labrada. I'm here with Dr. Dan Gartney. And if you want more information on fitness, nutrition, motivation, be sure to visit our website at www.labrada.com.